Welcome to a lecturette I've entitled PowerPoint Do's and Don'ts. I've put the word slideware in parentheses because what I have to say doesn't apply strictly to PowerPoint. Slideware is the genre of programs that do what PowerPoint does, like OpenOffice Impress or Apple's Keynote product. The problem is PowerPoint's become synonymous with slideshow generation to the point that no one knows what I'm talking about unless I name drop up front. So keep that in mind throughout this presentation. The topics herein address general considerations about content, that is, the material you present, the so-called law of inverse distance, a couple of case studies, authoring tools for doing slide presentations, do's and don'ts, attire, and graphics considerations. First, what is content? Content is the information you present to an audience, and it comes in static and dynamic forms. Static content is like this slide number 3. It's text or graphics that don't move. Dynamic content moves. It could be a sound, transition effect, embedded YouTube video, or a link you can click on to bring up a web page during the presentation. It may also be programming behind the show that allows your audience to interact with the content or get feedback, such as an embedded quiz that pauses the presentation, if only to see if people were paying attention. In any presentation, the law of inverse distance applies. That is, display resolution is inversely proportional to audience distance. This may sound like rocket science, but it's really quite simple. If you're presenting on site, people in the audience don't exactly have their nose in the screen. Most people beyond the first row will have a difficult time making out massive amounts of text in your slides. So the rule of thumb is to emphasize graphics. People online are actually near the screen. Therefore, you can include more text and de-emphasize graphics, even if a picture is worth 1,000 words, because a screen in front of your nose is almost as readable as a book. Speaking of rocket science, the quintessential examples of what not to do in slide presentations are covered in a couple of case studies in Edward Tufte's book, Visual Explanations, and follow-up essay, The Cognitive Style of PowerPoint. The first case study concerns the Challenger disaster of the 1980s. I was around back then and recall the event vividly. At launch, there was a puff of smoke observed emanating from one of the solid rocket boosters of the shuttle, signaling a leak. As the rocket gained altitude, the leak expanded, finally igniting the liquid booster fuel tank, causing the shuttle to explode. The official explanation for the disaster was the infamous O-ring problem. The shuttle launched on a record cold day for the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, causing the rubber O-ring seals in the booster rockets to harden up and not seal the hot gases within. What most people don't know is that this was a known issue with the sealant rings, and in fact, the day before the shuttle launched, the makers of the booster rockets, Morton Thiokol, flew to the launch site and implored NASA not to launch the shuttle. The trouble began with the title slide of their presentation. Already, they're using jargon, SRM for solid rocket motors, and all uppercase block lettering, which is less readable than mixed case characters. It gets worse with the very next slide, which is difficult to read, jargony, and also rendered in low resolution uppercase characters. The third slide is worse still. The text is jargony, indiscernibly small, with handwritten scrawled notations. Even the diagrams were difficult to understand, though the attention of the politicos present was probably long lost by now. They were motivated to go to launch because Christy McAuliffe was to be the first teacher in space aboard this launch. So, given that the disaster predicted by Morton Thiokol engineers was borne out the very next day, in many respects we can blame the Challenger disaster on a lousy slide presentation. The question is, could it happen again? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. History repeated itself in the Columbia disaster. The second shuttle explosion also resulted from a known issue cited by Boeing engineers as a concern before launch. Stupidly choosing to launch on another cold day, this time some insulating foam, which gets brittle in cold weather, broke off at launch, striking and damaging re-entry insulating material on the leading edge of the wing. Again, engineers from Boeing flew to the Space Center and implored that NASA have the astronauts inspect the exterior of the craft and make repairs. This is an actual slide derived from their presentation. It's jargony and packed too densely with text. Again, failing to convince their audience, the Columbia shuttle was doomed. This time PowerPoint was used, so we can more strongly argue that a lousy PowerPoint slideshow was to blame. The proverb, "a picture is worth 1,000 words," is attributed to Confucius. Ed Tufte has taken this to heart in writing a series of best-selling books that focus on visualization. That is to say, how can we communicate better using pictures? Napoleon's March to Moscow is a famous anti-war poster by Menard that Tufte uses to exemplify the essence of good graphics. The poster depicts 5 variables: geographical location, time, troop strength, events, and ambient temperature in depicting Napoleon's doomed campaign during the War of 1812. As the Germans were to learn in repeating history 100 years later, you never wage war on the Russians, especially at a time cited by many as the mini ice age. Reportedly, temperatures in 1812 were the coldest in recorded history. The thickness of the line shows the impact on his troops, starting with approximately 400,000 and finishing with 4,000 survivors. There is one point on the return where, in crossing a river in France, approximately 2/3 of the troops fell through the ice and drowned. The name of that river is synonymous with the word disaster in French. Menard created the poster in 1860 to depict the futility of war. If you can put up one graphic that does as good a job at making your point, your presentation will succeed. For more on this, every self-respecting educational technologist should own copies of Tufte's 4 seminal books: Visual Explanations, Envisioning Information, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, and most recently, Beautiful Evidence. Tufte has also put out a couple of short essays, one on the cognitive style of PowerPoint and another on visual and statistical thinking. Tufte is a retired biostatistician, and these works are a culmination of his life's work, which is to make numeric data more understandable through pictures. So in the next series of slides, I'm going to provide you with some tips for making more effective presentations, many of which are derived from Tufte's books and seminars. The first recommendation is to always present slides in landscape and not portrait orientation. Most screens are wider than they are high, and portrait orientation doesn't effectively utilize the available screen real estate. The next suggestion is to always leave a white space master border on the periphery of your slides. Apart from framing the content, this provides space for annotations and ensures that portions of the content won't be cropped if they lie outside the page boundaries of a printer. There should also be a method to your madness in creating a slide presentation that's like the organizational recommendations for writing a good essay. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. The title slide should contain a brief but descriptive title with a byline so people can get in touch with you. The second slide is the Advanced Organizer slide or table of contents. Here, you enumerate the subject headings of subsequent slides. Those slides then reiterate the topics in the Advanced Organizer slide and flesh out the details. In fact, before you fill in the details, you can create each one of the subordinate slides with headings so you stay on track in your development. The next set of recommendations pertain to fonts. It's better to use sans serif fonts in electronic displays as they're more readable. Serif fonts like Times Roman have little horizontal hats and feet that improve readability in print but detract from it on displays. Fonts should also be 18 to 24 points at minimum, so projected texts are visible from the back of the biggest auditorium. Never use italics, underline, or script fonts, as these detract from readability. Mixed case, with its ascenders and descenders, is better than all uppercase letters. Things that look different are easier to distinguish and remember. I once lectured at a military academy and went in naively thinking that I'd have an easier time remembering the cadets' names by virtue of their name tags. To my dismay, I discovered that you can't read name tags from a distance, and it was much harder to distinguish a room full of people in uniform, all dressed the same. The same holds true for fonts. However, avoid artsy mixes, as these don't enhance readability. In fact, only kidnappers employ this nefarious technique to hide their identity. The next set of recommendations concern bullet lists versus number lists. The general recommendation is to not use bullet lists, even though they are the default in most Slideware applications. Number lists allow your audience to refer to talking points by number rather than, hey, could you go back a few slides to that statement you made about X somewhere in the middle? Number points serve as a navigational aid, which enhances discussion, and students retain more as the result. If you hearken back to the days of acetate slides and overhead projectors, you may have seen presenters use an opaque slip sheet to successively reveal their talking points. The thinking here is that if you flash everything at once, tipping your hand as it were, people are inclined to write everything down and stop listening to you. This is variously called the rain-down effect or progressive disclosure. A corollary is the 6x6 rule, which states that no slide should contain more than 6 words across or 6 points per slide. The idea here is to reduce cognitive load, so this makes intuitive sense, and I have a student doing a study to test whether the hypothesis is valid. Another corollary is to distribute handouts with onerous details. I once witnessed a colleague copying and pasting 90 pages of legislative text into a slideshow that no one could read or understand and seemed entirely pointless. Our job as presenters is to make life easier to understand, not harder. The next recommendation is to use background and foreground color selections that have a high contrast ratio to improve readability. It turns out black characters on a white background work best. It may seem bland and not very artsy, but you need to focus on what's cognitively effective, not pretty or even distracting to look at. While we're on the subject of backgrounds, it's really best to have a monocolored desktop wallpaper without all of your files, folders, cutesy pictures of your significant others, kids, or pets on public display. They're distractors. In fact, if you're not a good presenter, you're giving your audience even more excuses to not pay attention. The black background on the left is preferable to the busy desktop on the right. It also makes sense to number all of your slides except the first for navigational purposes. Certainly, it helps if you've ever printed them out and dropped them, needing to sort them back into order. This way, students can refer to point 3 on slide 17, for example, rather than futzing around with a few slides back somewhere in the middle. You should also include an email address on the title slide in case anyone needs to get in touch. One other point about transition effects between page flips. Avoid use of sound effects like train wrecks. They're sound candy, but distracting and add nothing to the presentation. Thompson's Catechism at IBM rings true here. KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. I've never been clear on whether stupid referred to the audience or presenter, but the idea here is to avoid the type of jargony language in slideshows that led to the demise of the 2 space shuttles. And of course, Tufte's raison d'etre is to favor graphics over text whenever possible, like Beatlemania on Broadway. In keeping with the learning objects approach to instructional design, you have at your disposal a wide repertoire of multimedia objects that you can integrate into a slide presentation in addition to text and pictures. The model for a good presentation is an art history class, which you might have experienced from the nosebleed aisle of a lecture hall rife with the mist of cannabis. In my experience, there were documentary film clips, interviews with contemporary artists and art critics, and of course beautiful pictures to look at with a running narrative. If you're presenting as a consultant or representative of a corporation, you ought to have either a picture of yourself or a company logo, typically in the upper right-hand corner of the title slide, for personal or corporate presence. If the presentation is given in your absence, your picture is the only sense people have that it's actually you talking to them. An old theater trick is useful when giving presentations. Breathe through your nose and not through your mouth. Try it. breathe through your nose for a moment or two. That slows you down, resulting in better pacing and doesn't dry out your throat. By the way, try to guess whose celebrity nose I'm featuring here. Most people have a tendency to shout when they present to a large group and gasp for air through their mouth. Use a microphone so you don't have to strain yourself in a big room. You should also have your presentation available in multiple file formats in order to share it with the members of the audience afterwards. PPT format is native to PowerPoint, but remember, not everybody uses or likes PowerPoint. There's a free PowerPoint player available for download, but the better approach is to render your presentation as an Adobe PDF, as that's universal. You can also output your presentation in HTML format as a web page, or print it on paper or transparency stock. Nowadays, you can also carry it on a USB thumb drive as a backup or as a clickable download on a website. A good file naming convention to follow is the title of your presentation, a break character, and then the PPT or PDF extension. Many systems still don't permit a space character in a file name, so a break character, otherwise known as an underscore, is the next best thing. Don't assume that you or anyone else is going to remember the exact title of your wonderful presentation in a couple of years. In fact, assume you're going to forget it and that you'll have to go rummaging for it on your hard drive someday. One of my pet peeves is when people read their blasted slides to the audience. Perhaps they're insecure and think they'll forget to say something. Remember, almost all of us can read, and on-screen text adds to cognitive load. People are wired to intake information on 3 channels: visual, auditory, and reading. The problem is, we can only effectively process 2 channels at a time. Reading text we can see makes life difficult. You've experienced this if you've ever tried reading the subtitles of a foreign movie while watching the drama unfold and listening to the dialogue. We've already mentioned the detractions of transition sounds. They add to cognitive load too and diminish your effectiveness. Also, don't forget to turn off automatic slide advance unless your presentation is destined for a kiosk in the mall. All you need is one person to field a question while your slideshow races ahead without you. Manual slide advancement is best. Tufte also recommends pacing your presentation quickly and backtracking for questions at the very end. Hollywood figured out a long time ago that they'll lose an audience if they linger on a scene for more than 2 minutes. Remember the 2-minute limit. The first thing I do when arriving on site for a presentation is to either turn off or remove the light bulbs right above the screen so they don't wash out the projection. Don't ever turn off the lights in the rest of the room, however, as this seems to stimulate melatonin production, and people like me will nod off in self-defense. Keep in mind, if you're presenting on your laptop, that cute pictures of your kids or pets will at best be distractors to your audience. There are also regulations against depicting pictures of your students without consent on your screen. Solid screen colors are best. I set mine to black, as that also prolongs the life of the display. We mentioned earlier that your presentation should be available in multiple file formats for sharing. Well, you also want it available to you as a backup in case your computer blows. If you happen to be using a conventional overhead projector with acetates, it's best to project onto a screen that's tilted down to avoid a trapezoidal image known as the keystone effect. Better still, the screen should be in the corner of the room, freeing up the whiteboard for your annotations. I've never understood why people mount white pull-down screens above whiteboards. Perhaps that's because the people who mount screens don't teach with them for a living. Tufte also recommends arriving early to connect informally with the audience and leave plenty of time at the end for questions. Now for a few pointers on attire. The general recommendation is never wear white, especially if your presentation is being recorded. White creates hot spots, and any motions on your part may cause ghosting in the recorded image. Hawaiian shirts of the Tom Selleck variety are also verboten, as the colors tend to bleed in the recording. Not on modern cameras per se, but more likely on the sort of cheapo ones organizations buy or people use with their cell phones. Also, if you're being recorded with a green screen for a floating image, don't wear green yourself. Remember, the weatherman never wears green, lest part of his or her body appear as holes to the underlying map. As they teach in film school, pastels work best. Turning now to graphics, as they're the focus of any great presentation. The buzzword of the day is disambiguate, which means use pictures or parts of pictures that are not ambiguous. Now, you may know what you're looking at, but that doesn't mean the rest of us have any idea. For example, Google the word ambiguous image, and you'll come up with the black and white image to the left. Now, if you put this picture up in front of 100 people, probably 90% wouldn't know what it is until you told them. Just like those bar pictures you're supposed to stare at to see leaping dinosaurs. This is actually a black and white photo of a Dalmatian standing in a pile of autumn leaves. The minute you tell people that, they connect the dots. Similarly, the picture on the right is a rainforest montage. If you're talking about parrots, however, keep in mind that there are two birds in the picture, and people may not know which one you're referring to. This is known in cognitive psychology as the expert blind spot problem. The trouble is, you know what you're presenting because you're the expert, but the audience lacks your background knowledge. That's why they're sitting there and not at the head of the class. Another manifestation of the expert blind spot problem is the duck-rabbit illusion made famous by William James. To some people, the black and white picture here looks like a rabbit. Others see it as a duck. In perusing the internet recently, I actually came across this photograph of a real-life duck rabbit spotted by somebody in a park. Examples of expert blind spot abound on the internet. Just Google the words "stupid math answers" and you'll come up with ones like these. Proximal labeling is a common sense technique to improve the efficacy of graphics. The trick is to label examples closest to their points of use. So, for example, rather than making a bullet list of the color wheel, label the colors in place. The further related items are graphically, the more likely it is that people will dissociate them. Where you position graphics on a slide also matters. In an MIT study, 100 or so undergraduates were put in a room and handed copies of the yellow pages. After some time, the yellow pages were collected, and the students were asked to recall all the display ads they remembered. Most remembered ads that appeared in the upper left-hand corner of the page. The moral of the story is, the upper left is Park Avenue when it comes to display real estate. Exploit it for the best retention effect. One of the examples Tufte uses in his live seminars, which I've had the pleasure to attend, is the use of embedded iconography. He cites Galileo's treatise on the moons of Jupiter as an example. At the time of its publication, printing technology was still fairly new and scientific vocabulary in its infancy. Whenever Galileo ran out of words to describe what he'd seen, he'd lapse into drawing pictures, sometimes mid-sentence, to the effect, "I've seen the moons of Jupiter and they look like this." The moral of the story is that in modern documentation, we should more often embed pictures of what we're talking about rather than describe them. For example, there's a famous story of the student who, when asked to hit the enter key, typed out the letters ENTER. When referring to icons on a computer screen, show actual screen captures of the icons mid-sentence. If a function is invoked by hitting the enter key, show the key, not the words. A contrast between the publications of Galileo and Newton points to another slideware design consideration. Probably the most famous scientists of their respective times. Coincidentally, Newton was born in 1642, the year of Galileo's death. While Galileo used embedded iconography, printing was more advanced in Newton's day. The problem is, some of the figures in Newton's texts were dissociated from his mathematics. In fact, some were put in the appendix at the back of the book, where few would take the time to find them, let alone know of their existence. Reading mathematics or physics without access to an illustration doesn't abet the clarity of your ideas. Newton recognized this and insisted in subsequent editions that figures be proximate to the textual descriptions. To clarify numeric data, such as the cancer survival statistics shown here, there are good and bad graphical depictions. In the plot of the data shown to the right, the sheer volume of the peaks actually renders the data incomprehensible. This graphic actually appeared in a 1994 edition of the New England Journal of Medicine. As an alternative to chart junk graphs, Tufte offers a better approach. If the data is normalized to a 100-point scale, or percentages, separated out in an exploded view. That way people can make sense of the comparisons right from the data itself. Finally, and this is sort of tongue-in-cheek, there isn't really a whole lot you can present in the available real estate of a slide. The contrast is evident in Tufte's illustration of character counts and density per page image. The physician's desk reference tops the list at 13,600 characters per page. Ranging down through new sites on the internet, note that PowerPoints are at the very bottom of the scale, averaging 98 characters per slide in canned packages accompanying standard textbooks. That just goes to show how little you can cover in the average lecture, and why I make the case that you might as well watch them in the comfort of your home over a bowl of soup in your kitchen or living room. And of course, there are the ever-handy pause and stop buttons.